It is time for us to begin our second hour this morning, and looking at Judges 7th chapter. It's gotten down to verse 19. Howard, during the break, mentioned that in verse 17, Gideon was basically saying, look, follow my example, and that a lot of people in the church today shun from doing such, but we are to be examples. We are to be an example of the believer, and he mentions 1 Corinthians 11:1, in which Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. So we are to be good examples, and that's very true. We are to be. Now then, as we come to verse 20, we see here the three companies basically following Gideon's lead and doing exactly what he had told them to do: breaking the pitchers, holding up the light, blowing the trumpet, shouting the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Verse 21, every man was engaged in standing and doing his part. And again, we could spend a great deal of time looking at that every man in his place, every man engaged in it. But also look at it from this standpoint. They stood, every man in his place. When we take a stand for the Lord, we must take a stand. And no one can do it for us. We got to do it ourselves. Now, there is a place for everyone in the work of the Lord. Elders have their place. Preachers have their place. Deacons, Bible class teachers. Every member has their place. And no one can take that place for us. When when trouble does come, though, when people do not take their rightful place, or they try to take some place that is not rightfully ours. I don't know how many times congregations have been disturbed because a preacher tries to take the place of the eldership. I know of many occasions where that's happened. That's a situation where one individual is trying to take the place of someone else when he has no right to that place. And not everyone can be an elder. Not everyone can be a preacher. We see a lot of liberalism today in that women are trying to take those roles that are not right for them to take. Not everyone can do those things. But that doesn't mean that there is not a work which they cannot do. They might not be able and not have the right to do this one work, but they can do other things. We each have different abilities. We have different opportunities. And each one of us must take advantage of the abilities and the opportunities that we as an individual have. And we're not going to be judged simply on the basis of how many abilities we have, but how we have used those abilities, if we've used them properly or not. And we need to remember that in our lives. Do we use the opportunities and the abilities that God gives unto us to use? Not try to take someone else's place and their opportunities. We're not going to be judged by those things. When I was a younger preacher, I deny that I'm an old preacher, so I'm still young. So it's when I was younger preacher, an older preacher at that time gave me a great lesson when I was mentioned to him in relationship to the elders of a congregation I was working with. And I said something along the lines, how can I get them to do such and such? And I don't even remember what it was, but I remember the lesson that he taught me. that it was not my responsibility to get them to do anything. It was my responsibility to preach the Word. It was their responsibility as elders of the church to do those things, which was their responsibility. It wasn't my responsibility to get them to do those things. But my responsibility was to preach the Word. They were going to be judged on how they met their obligations. I was going to be judged upon the basis of my meeting my obligations. It wasn't my lot to try and take over in that way to get them to do things. That was their responsibility. Well, see that here. Every man stood in his place round about the camp. Verse 22, when they did all of these things, it caused confusion in the camp of the Midianites. You can imagine here they've just probably laid down, they've gone to sleep, gotten pretty good asleep probably, and now then these individuals who had just come out for this middle watch, they might still be a little bit asleep and not be well awake yet, and then all these things happening, and they're waking up all of a sudden and hearing this and hearing the commotion and seeing all of the confusion about them. They just start getting their swords and they striking out at whatever was near and ending up fighting each other, and the rest of them fleeing for home. So they begin fleeing, and he mentions Beersheba and Tabith, which were on the southeast end of the Harod Valley, standing on either side of the Jordan River. So they are basically going to this area where they would be fording the Jordan River, fleeing for home. Verse 23 then, the Israelites, now aided by men out of Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh, pursued after the Midianites. So now then at this point in time, Gideon calls for these other individuals to come and help him out in chasing them down. Bob Winton, in our commentary there, writes one who is, and that should be feeling for his life, or fleeing for his life instead of felling. I misspelled that. One who is fleeing for his life cannot fight, and there was no one to rally them to take a stand. So that is true. They were running for their life. You can't really fight while you're running, and no one was there to stop them from running away, from fleeing, and rally them around, come here and let's get together and let's go out and take a stand against the enemy, that we can defeat them. We're stronger than they are. Verse 24 then, Gideon asked for help from these tribes in the northern part of Canaan to control the fords of the Jordan, and they do control those fords, that place where they would ford the Jordan River to go home, and controlling those. Thus, as these Midianites would flee for home, they killed many of the Midianites at that point in time. In verse 25, Israel also took the two princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. Oreb means raven, and Zeb means wolf. And they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon on the other side of Jordan. So we're going to learn, or we learn that they were killed, Oreb at a rock and Zeb at a wine press, and each one of those bears the name of that individual. Chapter 8 now, we see Gideon's failure. In chapter 8, Gideon's failure. And In the first 3 verses of that chapter, we see the jealousy of the Ephraimites. In verse 1, we're going to see that we have here the Ephraim's complaint against Gideon. And basically, they're asking, why didn't you invite us to join in the battle? Well, he did, in a sense. In chapter 6 and verse 35, he did not, but later on he does. And because they were not initially invited to join in the battle, they took this as an insult. It almost appears as if the Ephraimites were striving for leadership in Israel. We want to be the leaders. In reality, though, they did not have any basis for their complaint. Gideon was simply following God's directions in all of this. In following God's directions, if God had told him, go ask the Ephraimites to join in the battle, then he would have done that. God didn't instruct him in that way or to do that, so he didn't do it. He was following God's directions. Thus, if they had a complaint, and they did not in reality, but if they had a complaint, it should have been against God, not against Gideon. In verse 2, Gideon basically says, the things that are left for you are better than what I've done. And that is the capturing of these 2 leaders of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. Those things are better than what you could have done in the fight. Constable writes about this, that the gleanings of Ephraim refers to the lives and spoils the Ephraimites took from the fleeing Midianites, and the vintage of Abiezer refers to the Midianites that Gideon and his 300 men had defeated and slain. The Ephraimites' victory was greater too, in that they had killed 2 Midianite commanders, Oreb and Zeb. So when Gideon says, what have I done now in comparison to you, he is, in a sense, telling the truth. But also, notice, and here again, you see good leadership capabilities on the part of Gideon. He was not concerned with who got the credit. So many times we get in our minds, and it becomes important to us within our life and as what we do as Christians as to who gets the credit. Did I get the credit for doing this? And sometimes it's even, did they give me enough credit? Did they praise me enough? And yet, that's not the attitude that we see with Jesus. In Matthew, the 20th chapter, and starting in verse 26, and going through verse 28, Jesus says, but it shall not be so among you. I started to write down Matthew 20, but it's 26 through 28. It shall not be so among you, but whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. And whoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. And even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. There's the attitude that we need to possess. It doesn't make any difference who gets the credit. I'm here to serve. We also see this in Matthew, the 23rd chapter, verses 11 and verse 12, "But he that is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that shall humble himself shall be exalted." So we see this same principle in both of these passages, that we should not be concerned with who gets the credit. We should be there concerned with, am I willing and am I going to serve God and do what God wants me to do? Well, verse 3, Gideon's words or answer to the Ephraimites appeased or their complaint. It appeased them. And thus it was settled between Gideon and the men of Ephraim. Problems, let's face it, are going to come up among brethren. That's just the nature of man, and we need to be prepared for it. There are going to be problems among brethren. But generally, it's the attitude of the brethren as to whether or not the problem is resolved. We see a great lesson here with Gideon. Gideon knew how to answer properly. He could have told them and taken an arrogant attitude and a harsh attitude that God didn't tell me to call you, you weren't worth it. Or however he wanted to word it, and an arrogant attitude, and that would have just escalated the problem. There would have caused hatred among brethren. But instead, he answered in a way that appeased them. Solomon, we say he's a wise man, and rightfully so, would tell us that a soft answer turneth away wrath. And that's very true. And then he adds, grievous words stir up anger. Well, we see a good illustration of that here. The soft words turned away the anger of the people, of the Ephraimites. A harsh anger would have caused more problems. In Proverbs 25 and verse 15, but long forbearing by long forbearing is a prince persuaded, and a soft tongue breaketh the bone. There could have been a bone of contention between them, but Gideon wasn't concerned with who got the credit. He was concerned with satisfying the people, encouraging them, strengthening them, instead of stirring them up to anger. We need to take lessons from him as to his great leadership capabilities along this line as well. The next section, verses 4 through 21 in chapter 8, is the complete victory over the Midianites or over the invader. In verse 4, Gideon does make the request for some help, and it seems as if the 7th chapter gives us the conclusion of it, while here in chapter 8 we are going back over it and giving a little bit more detail that's involved in it. Gideon comes to Jordan, passes over. Well, I said that wrong. I was getting ahead of myself and thinking of something later. This is where Gideon asked for some help from some people on the other side of Jordan after he crosses Jordan, because his 300 men, we see in verse 4, are getting physically tired and they're hungry. And so we're going to see that the men of Succoth and Penuel refuse the help and aid. But from their physical being tired, we also can learn the lesson that sometimes from a spiritual standpoint we get tired. But in spite of being tired, as the men here of Gideon, they had to continue on. They had to persevere, not be weary in well-doing. That's the only way that we're going to win the battle. The battle's not for the faint-hearted, and it's not for those who will quit on the way, but only by perseverance. Remember what Paul would write in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 58, that we are to be unmoved, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as you know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Well, there's that attitude of we're going to continue on. Verse 5, we have the men of Succoth first, and also we're going to see the men of Penuel. Both of them were on the east side of Jordan, beside the Jabbok River. Thus, they lived closer to the Midianites than they did to most of the Israelites. Gideon explains to the men, we're hungry, and that is because we're pursuing after the kings of Midian. Well, the men of Succoth, verse 6, basically say, we're not going to give you any help, even though you and your men are growing tired. We're not going to help you. Hill and Delitzsch write about this, that in these words, that is, denying Gideon bread, verse 6, there is not only an expression of cowardice or fear of the vengeance which the Midianites might take when they returned upon those who had supported Gideon and his host, but contempt of the small force which Gideon had, as if it were impossible for him to accomplish anything at all against the foe. And in this contempt they manifested their utter want of confidence in God. And that's true. How in the world do you think with just this small handful of men that you're going to defeat the Midianites? And so we're not going to give you help, because if we give you help, then the Midianites are going to come back and they're going to cause us pain. They're going to be harsher upon us because we gave you help. And we don't think you can take the Midianites with just such a small force. Therefore, they don't do it. Constable makes an interesting point also about this when he says that note the spirit of regionalism that had developed in Israel since the days of Joshua. These Transjordan Israelites showed no sense of brotherhood or national responsibility. Their lack of cooperation illustrates what both Moses and Joshua feared would happen to the Israelites who lived east of the Jordan River. Numbers 32:16 or 6 through 15 and 20 through 27, and Joshua 22:13 through 20. The seeds of national disintegration had germinated, he writes. And again, we see that as a point well taken. These were the brethren of Gideon and these 300 soldiers. Why didn't they say, oh, we're going to help you and we'll even join in the battle with you? But instead, they were their brethren, but instead of that type of an attitude, you see a lack of cooperation on their part. Well, verse 7, we have Gideon's response. Gideon promises a punishment because they failed to give help and aid. In verse 8, he then goes to Penuel. And apparently Penuel is very close to Succoth, and like the men of Succoth, Penuel also refuses to give any help, and based upon the same reason as the men of Succoth gave. Where are these individuals that you're seeking? If they were in your hand, then yeah, maybe we would, but we don't believe you can defeat them. Verse 9, the men of Penuel hear basically the same promise of punishment as the men of Succoth. Verse 10 then, Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor. Karkor was a city on the eastern side of Gad. They had about 15,000 men left. Thus, Apparently these Midianites, 120,000 men or soldiers, had been slain in the battle, and probably the majority of them killing each other in the initial onslaught or the initial start of battle. Verse 11, Gideon caught up with them and attacked them in a surprise attack. Apparently in these in Karkor, they felt like they were safe. They thought they were secure now, and thus they let down their guard for a little bit, and Gideon caught them in a surprise attack. Verse 12, the two kings fled from the battle, and Gideon pursued after them and caught them. Verse 13, it is mentioned that Gideon, the returning from battle before the sun was up. That's the King James. The American Standard and the New King James has the ascent of Heres for the King James before the sun was up. This is an area, possibly an inclined roadway or pass, leading to the town of Heres that is in the Jabbok Valley. Verse 14, they caught a young man of the men of Succoth, and in capturing him, they get him to describe the leaders of the town who had refused help to Gideon and his army. So now then in verse 15, he comes to the men of Succoth, and he shows them, I captured the kings of Midian. You asked me where these kings were, and now then here they are. Joe asked how many of the original enemy was it that Gideon went up against. And it appears as if from verse 10 that it would have been about 15,000 left of the 120,000. Or, excuse me, 135,000. Thus, 120,000 men have been slain in battle, 15,000 men left, and that's who they would have gone up against here in this surprise attack, apparently. Verse 16, Gideon takes the elders of the city, and he, as a judge now in Israel, it's his responsibility to punish these cities. And notice the word taught here, that he took the elders of the city and thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them he taught the men of Succoth. Taught deals with discipline. And discipline sometimes can be severe and even sometimes deadly. Winton, again, writes concerning this, in describing this teaching here, that the victims were placed on the ground and covered with thorns and briars. A heavy sled was pulled over them, pushing the thorns into the flesh. Perhaps the sledges were heavy enough to crush them, with the thorns and briars added to increase the pain or ensure death. The layers of thorns and briars may have been placed underneath the victims. So this would have been a very painful or excruciating teaching or punishment that Gideon is bringing upon these leaders of the city of Succoth, or the men of Succoth. In verse 17, it says that he beat down the tower of Penuel and slew the men of that city. It's interesting to that some individuals have charged Gideon with losing control in his punishment of these cities. Block stated in effect that he acted like a general out of control, no longer bound by rules of civility. That's a false charge. Gideon was, and we go back to that word, he's teaching them. That is a discipline, yes, severe discipline, even deadly discipline, because of their refusal to come and to aid the men of Gideon. Remember in chapter 5, cursing Meroz, because they did not come to the aid of God's people. Well, now then, Gideon is punishing these people because they failed to do that, and because of their ridicule of the power of God, in effect, that you can't defeat the Midianites with your small army. Verse 18, he says now he asks these kings about the men, Zebah and Zalmunna, about the men that they had killed at Tabor. And basically they answer, as thou, they. Each one resembled the children of a king. In other words, it might be that he's saying they looked like you looked. Their look was like yours. Or that they simply resembled sons of a king. Either way, we could understand it either way in that sense. But by this answer, Gideon recognized, you have executed my brothers. And he tells them, if you had saved them alive, I would spare you. Again, Constable writes concerning this that Gideon probably would not have applied the lex talionis as he did here if his brothers had died in battle. The Midianite kings had evidently murdered them. So because they had murdered them, instead of it being simply a battle, and those brothers of Gideon dying in a battle, which would be, in that sense, an honorable death, these Midianite kings simply murdered them. And so, as a result of that, Gideon is going to execute them. Well, verse 20, Gideon instructs his oldest son to Jether to slay them. And very possibly he asked his oldest son to do it, probably to humiliate these two kings. But Jether did not even draw his sword because he feared. He was still a youth. And so, because of his fear, he didn't do it. And so, verse 21, the two kings basically say to Gideon, well, why don't you just go ahead and kill us yourself? And so Gideon accommodates them. Again, Constable writes concerning this latter part about the ornaments that they get that were on their camel's neck, that the crescent-shaped ornaments that Gideon took from the king's camels were presumably gold and silver. The Arabians commonly wore these around their necks and used them to decorate their camels. These particular ornaments would have been very valuable since they belonged to their kings. And every time I come to that term Arabians, I think of a time in which I was in high school and having to read the list of names in Acts, the 2nd chapter, of all of the Jews who were at Jerusalem at the time. And I was mispronouncing, I think, every one of the names, and people finally thought, well, he's coming to a name that he'll recognize and he'll be able to pronounce. And instead of saying Arabians, I said Arabians. That's why I kind of snickered when I came to that. Well, now then, in verses 22 through verse 32, we have Gideon's failure now. The men of Israel come to Gideon, ask him to rule over them. The hand of Midian had been upon the Israelites to such an extent that they had been greatly distressed. They had cried out to God. He called Gideon to save them from the Midianites. With that in mind, you come to this point, and very possibly simply out of respect for what Gideon has done and appreciation to him for what he has done, they ask him to rule over them and to begin a dynasty of rulers, not only you but your sons. And also in this, it might be not they are recognizing God has men with you, Gideon, and so we want you to rule over us. Verse 23, though, Gideon knew who was king over Israel. That is God. And thus, he refused to rule over them. Sometimes people desire things which they should not desire, even though they have a good motive. Their motive might be right, they are good, they might have a good heart in that which they desire, but what they're desiring is wrong, and they don't realize it. Apparently, that's the situation here. Gideon had a realization, God is our king, and no man is to rule over us. Verse 24, thus, Gideon does desire something. He then asks for all the golden earrings of their prey, of the Midianites. There's the question that enters into this, was Gideon being materialistic in this request? We know that there is a problem with materialism that's addressed in the Bible. Matthew, the 6th chapter, we're not to lay up treasures on earth, but lay up treasures in heaven. Where your heart is, there will your treasure be. Or where your treasure is, there will your heart be. In 1 Timothy 6 and verse 10, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Was Gideon being materialistic in this? Many people believe that he was simply being materialistic. He wanted wealth. There's others, though, on the other hand, that think that this is an innocent request. Since they're wanting to do something for him, he's just, instead of being king, he says, since you want to do something for me, and being king, God's our king, just give me this instead of making me king. And thus an innocent request, since they were wanting to do something. Could be either way. We don't really know. But verse 25, we'll see they willingly gave him the gold and the gold earrings. They spread a garment out, and every man gave him the gold earrings that they had. Verse 26, we see the amount, and this amount is estimated to be anywhere between 40 to 75 pounds in weight of gold. And that is depending on whether a light shekel or heavy shekel is used, and thus the weight of the shekel. Either way, whether it's 40 pounds of gold or 75 pounds of gold, either way, that is a huge amount of gold and would have been extremely valuable. Verse 27, out of this gold, Gideon makes an ephod. Now then, what is an ephod? It is ultimately going to be an image that's worshipped, although we cannot be totally sure of the nature of it. Kiel and Delitzsch write concerning it that the word ephod does not signify an image of Jehovah or an idol, as Gesenius and others maintain. So you have those who maintain here that this ephod is an image, it's an idol. Then they go on to write, but the shoulder dress of the high priest, no doubt, including the chosen belonging to it with the Urim and Thummim, as in 1 Samuel 14:3, 21:10, 23:6, 9, etc. So there's both aspects. You see Gesenius saying, well, it's an idol. Kiel and Delitzsch saying, no, it's that shoulder dress of the high priest. Whichever. We don't really know, and we can't say for certain what the ephod here is, which one of these it is. Nothing, though, in this, as far as Gideon making this ephod, is stated about his motive in making it. We do know the end results. The end result is that it becomes an image that was worshipped by Israel. Now, whether or not Gideon intended it for that purpose, we don't know. I would say, in my thinking, that Gideon did not intend it for that purpose. That's my own personal feeling, but we don't really know. But we do know that that's the end result of it. It did become such. Constable puts an interesting point on this, that thus Gideon became the first official sponsor of idolatry in Israel. He was doing what was right in his own eyes, Judges 17:6 and 21:25. And again, whether that was his intent or not is certainly up to debate, but that is the end result of it. Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown write concerning it, though, that no idolatrous use was in view, nor any divisive course from Shiloh contemplated, is manifest from Judges 8:33. Gideon proposed with the gold he received to make an ephod for his use only as a civil magistrate or ruler, as David did, 1 Chronicles 15:27, and a magnificent pectoral or breastplate also. It would seem from the history that he was not blamable in making this ephod as a civil robe or ornament merely, but that it afterward became an object to which religious ideas were attached, whereby it proved a snare and consequently an evil by perversion to Gideon and his house. So you have that aspect of what he was doing. Kundal and Morris write concerning this that perhaps it is easier to honor God in some courageous action in the limelight of a time of national emergency than it is to honor Him consistently in the ordinary everyday life, which requires a different kind of courage. Gideon, who came through the test of adversity with flying colors and was not the first nor the last to be successful in the test, or was not the first nor the last to be successful in the test of prosperity. So they take it as that he intended it basically and built it, made it as an idol. But the point that they are making, whether or not they are right, is true, that it is many times more difficult to live for Christ than it is to have some courageous action. One is put it that it's easier to die for Christ than it is to live for Him. And I think many times that's true. It's much more difficult to live for Christ on a consistent, everyday basis than it is a one-time act of bravery in dying for Him. But verse 28, you can go into a great deal of discussion and study if you want to as to this ephod that is made. Verse 28, it shows that the time of oppression was 7 years that they had undergone, and now then they have 40 years of rest or quietness. It's interesting that this is the last period of peace that is actually mentioned in Judges. Whether or not they had others is not the point here, but it's the last one that's mentioned in Judges. In verse 29 then, Gideon, or Jerubbaal, enjoyed the fruit of his victory the rest of his life and lived in his own house in Ophrah, which was in Manasseh. Verse 30, he, like many wealthy men of the past, had many wives, and it states that his wives bore him 70 sons. In verse 31, one of Gideon's concubines who lived in Shechem. Thus, he had at least one concubine in addition to his wives. And this one living in Shechem bore him Abimelech. And Abimelech means, my father is king. It may refer to God and not Gideon, but Abimelech understood it to mean Gideon. My father is king. Gideon is king, as the way Abimelech understands it, even though it might have initially meant God is king, or that's the way it was given. It might have been God is king, but he understood it as Gideon. We're going to read him in chapter 9 and how he acted, so he's introduced here. It's interesting that the sons of concubines generally did not receive an inheritance from their father. Verse 32, we have the death of Gideon. As all men do, Gideon died. He was buried in his ancestral tomb. Gideon is mentioned in Hebrews 11, verses 32 through verse 40, in that great Hall of Faith of Fame, or Faith's Hall of Fame. One point that we can make in verse 32 also is that we need to be prepared for our death. He, as all men died, we're going to die. We better be prepared for it. Now then, in verses 33 through verse 35, we have Israel's apostasy. And there's three things that are mentioned in these three verses. The first is that they refused to be righteous in verse 33. They turned and went whoring after Balaam. Like so many of the other times, when the judge died, they departed from God and went after idolatry. Baal-berith, which is the name mentioned here in verse 33, made Baal-berith their god, means Baal of the covenant, which indicates they made a covenant with Baal. Constable writes concerning this that, ironically, Shechem, the town where the Israelites had renewed their covenant with Yahweh when they entered the land, Joshua 8:24, became a site and center of this Baal worship. And that is sad that they had taken this place where they should have been worshiping God, and they applied it to Baal, or it becomes the center of Baal worship. Verse 34, we see that Israel did not remember God. This shows a lack of respect for God. And because of time, let me mention verse 35. In verse 35, the third thing is ingratitude. They did not show the kindness toward Gideon and his family which they deserved, and that's ingratitude. Our time's ended, and we will begin there at verse 34 and go through into chapter 9, not next week, because next week we will be off after Thanksgiving, but the week after that. Thank you for your attention, and we continue to encourage you to study God's Word, and we know that it will be a blessing to each of us.